Right, so my job at the meeting is to facilitate a discussion in there, to give some background for the discussion. So,
Have we got a chair? Are you
sorry?
chair as well? Are you chair?
Well, Mark can share it if we need a chair. Does that sound like it, unless you want to share?
No, you want a chair?
Mark, you chair it if we need a chair, because it's very small. We'll see how we get on, shall we? We just have 10 minutes at the end to talk about any future meetings, because maybe that's a bit of an issue, I think, because a few people are not here. But right, it was titled The Significance of the 84-85 miners' strike. But I think to fully appreciate how significant that strike was, we really need to look at it in terms of not just the strike itself and what happened in the strike itself, but its timing. In other words, what happened in the build-up to the strike itself, and what happened in the aftermath of it. And so what I've tried to do is split it into 4 sections, really. Is one, the actual decade and a half leading up to the strike. It sounds like a long period, but I think it's particularly important. It reminds you of a number of things, and it explains to some extent what happened in terms of the players in the 84-85 strike. That's to say, why did certain players, the union, the left and the right in the union, the Labour Party, the TUC, the state in its various guises, what role did they play and why and how? It comes out of very much that period prior to the big strike. So to talk a little bit of time, and spend a little bit of time on that, spend a bit of time on the strike itself and what happened during the strike, talk only very briefly about the aftermath of the strike, and then make some concluding remarks, if you like, lessons of the strike from our point of view. So to do it in that way. So I'm really starting, I think, usefully around October 1969. And why that was significant, I think, was because there was a whole wave of miners' wildcat strikes in that year. And when you think about it, I mean, that probably sticks in a lot of people's minds. 69, the 60s, the late 60s. I mean, it was Paris 68, it was the whole autumn in Italy in 69. I mean, there was a whole wave of struggle going on throughout Europe and in other parts of the world. So it was a very kind of vibrant period. And in October 69, there were these wave of wildcat strikes, where we saw the appearance for the first time, really for a long, long time anyway, of the flying pickets. Not the group, by the way. There was a group called the Flying Pickets, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But what I'm talking about, miners, flying pickets, self-organised pickets, trying to spread strikes from one pit and from one area to another. And flying pickets spread out and developed those strikes right across Yorkshire, Scotland, South Wales and the Midlands. And it involved something like 130,000 miners, so it's a big strike, you know, it's not just a little one-off, and 140 pits. It was over an issue of both wages and hours, but eventually there was a compromise developed through the National MUM and the TUC. TUC pops its head in quite a lot of times in some of these bigger disputes. They're always coming in, aren't they, to try and calm things down, get some kind of compromise. But it was a compromise that saw, if you like, some improvements. It got quite a big improvement in wages, but it didn't deal with any of the issues around hours, so that was the compromise, if you like. And the strikes then subsided. In October 1970, the following year, this is quite interesting because it leads on to other things. There was a full national MUM ballot on a strike, and at that time the rule was that you had to have 55% for a strike. And, well, sorry, you had to have 2/3 for a full all-out strike. And it got 55%, so it got a majority, but it didn't get the 2/3. So what was the result of that? Well, the result of that was there was another wave of wildcat strikes, because all the people that wanted to go out on strike and were determined to do something about their work, their wages and their conditions and so on, they didn't wait. They went out on a wildcat, and the end result of that was that 2 things were the end result of that. One was that they got another good wage offer. Wage offer, it's all relative, isn't it? But, by the Times, it was a pretty good wage offer as a result of wildcat strikes. The other thing that happened was that the left started to make some gains in the union, and one of the things that changed was the change in the ballot rule. So it was reduced to 55%, which is an interesting point. But that was a significant factor in later issues around whether strikes were sort of official or unofficial and so on. So that was quite an important development. And in 1971, there was another big attempt to have a go at wages and make a really big increase. By the way, wages, I say there were some good increases, but wages, I can't remember the exact figures now, I should have written it down. But in terms of across the board in industry, considering the job that was being done, especially with underground miners and the dangers of the job and so on, they weren't that high relative to other wages throughout industry. So there had still been a kind of build-up of feeling that there needed to be not just parity, but some real recognition in financial terms for what the job actually involved. And there was a big wage demand lodged. And this time, what we're talking about here, with the change in the rules, was that there was a major national strike launched, an official national strike. As soon as it was announced, immediately, 289 pits were closed, just like that. I mean, literally overnight, 289, all the pits closed. And interestingly, because it was an issue that came up again later, only 46 of those pits were left with safety cover. We'll come on to this again, there's a psychological factor in all this as well. That was quite a major issue. Bearing in mind, we'll come on to it, that miners themselves provided a certain amount of work for safety cover, but there was also the NACODs, which were like the foreman's union, if you like, which were also essential to the health and safety regulations in the pits. Now, NACODs weren't directly involved, but the picketing in many places stopped NACODs from going in, the NACODs men from going into pits, and that's why a lot of the pits there was no health and safety cover. So basically, the pits were at risk. It was part of the bargaining in a way. It was like, well, if you actually do want to keep these pits open, and remember during this period, coal was still a huge part of the energy structure of the British industry. So it was a proper bargaining chip. It wasn't just like, well, as it was later, as we will come to see, it didn't mind if the pits were flooded, they were going to close them anyway. This was a time where they really did want to keep the pits open. Again, there was a large-scale mass picketing throughout industry, throughout the coalfields. And there were attempts to picket other parts of the mining industry out. So, for instance, office workers that worked in the big NCB offices, research centres, places like that, a lot of those were picketed out. And there were, again, where some pits and some of the offices were still working, in Nottingham. Again, Nottingham keeps coming up for various reasons. There were clashes with the police. It started to become a common feature in these disputes. The other thing that started to happen were mass pickets of the power stations, quite obviously so, because they were reliant on coal in most cases, and it was to stop the coal going in. So if there were coal stocks, or if there were coal still being transported from outside the pits, then the point was to stop that. And there was some success there, starting off with Ferrybridge and then moving on to other. It's limited success, I would say, not 100% successful. And that led on to what is now, I think, famous. Most people probably remember it, because what it led on to in February '72 was the mass picket of the Saltley Coke depot. Anybody? Perhaps a lot of people remember that. But it was quite famous because this was it was a mass picket that went on for several days, and after each day the picket was kind of increasing, but there were battles with the cops and so on. And then the NUM, so it was officially called for pickets from the rest. This is in the Birmingham area, so called for pickets from the rest, solidarity from the rest of the working class in the local area, and there was a big response. So it was a mixture There was an official response from some of the unions and some local union branches, and there was a lot of unofficial stoppages as well. But the end result was that on one particular day, on the 10th, there were, how reliable these figures are, but it was reported that there were 12,000 workers outside the gates of Saltley. And as a result of that, basically, after endless shouts of shut the gates and so on, the police eventually decided that the only way to control it was to shut the gates, so the gates were shut. So there was disruption of supplies, and there was a temporary closure of the place. But it's perhaps, this is where Scargill and the left really comes from this in a way. It's what we're remembered for, it's like leading this particular. And it's significant, because it has what's the word? Scargill tries to do this all over again at a later date, but with less success, shall we say. Not that it was 100% successful the first time. There were quite a lot of power cuts as a result of all this activity, and there was the first one-off 3-day closure of industrial plants. So this wasn't the famous 3-day week when everything shut down. This was a preliminary. This was the first 3-day week, but it was a one-off organised by the government of all industrial plants, so a temporary shutdown, if you like. And there was something like 1.6 million workers laid off as a result of all that, all those cutbacks. Picketing was going on, and it was increasing. It was on a mass scale. The NUM itself, certainly the NUM nationally, and most NUM officials locally, was by this point trying to kind of pull it back a bit, calm it down, if you like. Not that it was sort of getting out of hand, if you like, and out of their control up to a point. But Carl's had a great deal of success. There were huge battles in Scotland in particular, huge battles with the police. I mention all this because it's like people think 84, 85, huge battles with the police, as though this was kind of the first time it ever happened. But no, this was a sort of regular feature of many of these disputes leading up to that period. And this time, this is February 72. This is 1972. This strike is particularly significant because it was an official strike, but with mass activity by the miners themselves. And basically, you could say it won in a way because the government panicked. I suppose you'd say they panicked. The government sort of set up this inquiry, the usual kind of thing, the great and the good were sort of set up to have an inquiry into the mines. They were really worried about it. They were very sympathetic to the miners, all their plight, it's terrible, all the usual gubbs that they come out with. But the end result of that government inquiry was that the government inquiry recommended wage increases for a range of miners and, both face workers and non-face workers, various other people, that ranged between 15 and 31.6%. This was the government's recommendation. This offer was 4 times what the NCB had offered and what a dispute was about. 4 times. Interestingly, the miners didn't accept it. So, not enough. Rubbish. They were on a winner. They felt like they were on a winner. They really needed the coal. Industry was being shut down all over the place. So it went on a bit longer, and basically it was settled eventually, and it was settled mainly in order to get the non-face workers a slightly better deal, because they always the sort of poor relations in a sense in the mining industry, and it was settled on that basis. But really, this was a major victory for the miners from their point of view, and against the government. The government just caved in and gave in to their demands, and it was all done within the space of less than 2 months. So it was a very radical strike, it was a big strike, it had official sanction, but mass activity, and it was a winner. That stuck in the minds of the miners, how it was achieved, stuck in the minds of the miners, but it also stuck in the minds of the government, and we shall see sort of where that led on to. I'm going to try and go a bit quicker, sorry. So move on to October 73. Now what happened in October 73? We had the Middle East War, sometimes known as the Yom Kippur War. And one of the results of that was that a lot of the Arab states started racking up the price of petrol. This was partly as a result of the war itself, partly was perhaps a political manoeuvre and so on. But that was one of the results. So that put the government under even more pressure in the following year. And the miners at this point, they were looking to engage in yet another annual battle to improve their conditions. But what came in place initially to try and bring the coal stocks down and put pressure on was an overtime ban. Now what's interesting is, bearing in mind what had happened in 72, is there was another bit of a panic, this time by the Heath government. I mean, the day after the overtime ban was actually announced, Heath declared a state of emergency. He didn't wait for anything to happen, he just said, right, we're not doing all this over again. Fucking hell, state of emergency now, let's get everything organised, let's start dealing with it. And that is when the 3-day week, the famous 3-day week came in. And you might remember, if you were around at that time, you remember I was working for the water board at the time, and I remember they started putting stickers up on all the little lights, save energy, blah, blah, blah. So we all went around, of course, putting the lights on, using as much energy as possibly could. It wasn't much in the way of solidarity action, but it was better than nothing anyway, because psychologically it made us feel good at the time. So that went on for some considerable time. Following the overtime ban, there was a union ballot for strike, and at that point, basically, this is when the famous general election was called, which was called on who governs Britain. And they were almost certain, the papers behind it support. I mean, you can imagine what was going on in the media and everything, I can't actually... Yeah, the strike started, that's right, it started. I can't remember, it was... These strikes are usually pretty solid. It was an official strike, remember. I can't recall that every pit was out, but it was certainly pretty solid. The result of the election, though, of course, as we all know, was that the Labour Party got elected. And immediately they were elected, they offered, they made an increase, or they forced the NCP to make an increased offer. And the strike was called off. So we call it a victory of sorts. Anyway, basically we weren't defeated, What followed that, though, is a whole series of things that probably people have forgotten about, because having got, the NUM and the unions having got their party, quote, in power, all this militancy was sort of, well, this is all right, chaps, but it's our people in power now, so, we've got to be a bit more reasonable, we've got to kind of work together and look after the national interest and all that kind of clobber that we sort of got fed up with. So then this is when the agreement was signed with the TUC for the thing called the social contract, which wasn't, as I recall, it wasn't, it was literally an agreement that the union signed up to. It wasn't legally enforceable, as I recall, but the union, it didn't need to be, because the union was really effective in trying to put it. And it was I think we call a 3-year, roughly a 3-year deal was the idea, to sort of give the Workers' Party, I don't have to say that, I use these things tongue in cheek, of course, a chance to sort of put things right. But, as you can imagine, with inflation increasing, it put more and more pressure on workers. So, as time went by, disputes started to emerge. And a lot of these disputes inevitably were wildcats, including in the mines as well. So it was a build-up of tension and opposition between, when I say wildcats, I mean some of them were completely unofficial, some of them were like local branches or whatever. There's always a mixed bag in these things. But basically the National Union certainly were consistently opposing them and squashing them wherever they could to try and keep their social contract in place. But around 77, so we're sort of 3 years in, again, wildcat strikes started to break out, they started to break out in the mines. And this, how did the Labour government deal with this? Well, good old Wedgie Ben, the sort of favourite left winger, this is when he was wheeled in, and between the Labour government and the NCB, they brought forward a new productivity scheme. And the idea was that basically, there would be quotas set with the agreement with the union, but on an area-by-area basis. Very significant, this productivity deal. Because what it meant in effect was that some of the pits, where they were really where they were basically very productive, good seams, easier to work and so on, were likely to get a better deal out of this and higher bonuses, because it was a bonus system essentially. Who were they? Well, basically Staffordshire was one of them, East Derbyshire I think, and one or two of the pits in Yorkshire, but not all of them. So a bit of a mixed bag. Now, to be fair, the majority of miners recognised this for what it was, that this was something that was going to split them. You know, it was going to divide them up as a potentially national force. And it's exactly what it was designed to do. Now, interestingly, there was a national ballot about this, and it was completely and utterly thrown out. So the national ballot went completely against signing any deal of this kind. And as far as I can recall, the majority vote on the NUM executive even went against it. It certainly did go against it at one stage. Delegate meetings went against it. Now, the peculiar thing about all this is, it then came in. How the hell did it come in? Well, it came in because there were machinations between at least a faction in the NUM, we call them a right-wing faction if you like, who were obviously hand in glove with the government and wanted to support it, wanted to get it in. The only way they could get it in was by holding area ballots. So in effect what they did, having rejected it nationally, they then held lots of separate area ballots, and of course all the areas that thought they would get a good deal out of it voted for it, and it came in, and the others voted against it. But it didn't come in immediately, but eventually it came in everywhere as a result of that. So that laid the groundwork for a lot of what came later in the 84-85 strike, and how it panned out, and why certain areas were for it and against it, and so on. So, actually it was South Derby, anyway, bloody hell, South Derby, East Derby, I can't quite work it out. While Labour was in power, the Tories nonetheless in 78 were preparing for power, shall we say, in a way, and they were preparing what later actually happened. So they had a plan, which it sounds very familiar now, doesn't it? They had a plan in advance of being in government even. And what it involved, building up the coal stocks, particularly at power stations. In other words, make sure that every power station had a huge supply of coal that would last like months and months and months without additional shipments. And also storing them elsewhere. So there was I think there was an arrangement to even store them at Rotterdam docks or something. They started leasing land, you know, in other coal ports in Europe, so on. And organising, well, should we say, planning to organise for alternative coal imports, or alternative sources of coal from abroad. So started talking to other sources, looking at ways in which they could set up, if you like, preliminary contracts to bring additional coal in. The other thing was recruiting non-union lorry drivers. Now we say non-union, and I think really this was the beginning of the whole kind of thing, which comes in later again, of the move towards sort of owner-driver lorries and all that, who, by the way, in most cases would still be part of the union. So it would be non-union, but it was a kind of change in the way that people worked and in their psychology that played a role later on. The other thing, of course, was to start converting or arranging as far as possible for plants that mainly relied on coal to be able to burn oil as well as coal, so that was one part of the thing. The other thing was they were looking at cutting Social Security in various ways. Because Social Security families of strikers, I think some strikers actually, but certainly families of strikers, could still claim various Social Security benefits. At that time, sounds strange now, doesn't it? It's like, you know. But anyway, this was the plan, was to cut back on all that, to sort of undermine any strike, support for the strike amongst the families. And the other big thing, of course, that we all recognise now was to organise national coordination of the police force and some kind of rapid response unit amongst the police. So all of that was planned in 78 with the Tories before they got in power. In 79, of course, they got in power. That was when Thatcher was elected. And the first thing they started to do, these plans were still being developed, remember, they didn't go away. They weren't being public, they didn't go away. But they did start bringing modernisation of the pits. Modernisation of the pits, of course, did mean investing in the pits, some of them, the good ones that they thought were worthwhile. But of course it also meant rationalisation and redundancies and all the rest of it as well. But really, those plans, I mean, they still weren't fully in place, they still weren't fully effective. So one of the things they didn't want to do was take on the miners straight away. There was a lot of testing of the water. But one of the testing of the water, I'm not going to go into this a lot because obviously I've got to speed up, but one of the things they've they did was not test it out on the miners at all, it was test it out on the steelmen. So in 1980, in fact, there was quite a big steel strike. But the strike, actually, does anybody remember Bill Sears? I mean, is he dead?
Bill Sears.
Sir Bill Sears, yeah.
Yeah, he's dead.
Rewarded for all his efforts. Right, good. But anyway, the thing is, I mean, he's a right bastard. I mean, you know. But I mean, the thing was, they brought in McGregor. Everybody remembers McGregor. He wasn't brought into the NUMP, to the mine strap. They brought him for the steel industry. You know, to run down the strap. It was his whole purpose of coming was to run down the steel industry. And plans were made to do that. And redundancies were threatened. And eventually, of course, Corby, which was a really big steel works, was threatened with closure altogether. Yeah, what happened to people who lived in Corby was a bit like what happened to, eventually anyway, to a lot of the mining areas that were closed down. You know, I mean, it was devastating, really, Corby, large parts of Corby. But, I mean, but basically, Bill Sears and the Steel Union did everything possible to try and avoid a strike at first. I mean, because they operated, they looked for a compromise, it was reasonable. But by this time, and there was massive oversupply of steel, of course, throughout Europe. And you had people like Brazil and Korea and all that coming in with big steel production and all that. So there was an issue from their point of view to rationalise the industry.
There's also a crisis as well.
There was a real crisis going on. So by this time, there was no, you know, the idea of a compromise was out. I mean, there was no intention. There was no intention of compromising. It was all out or nothing, and that was the case. So eventually, a strike was called. Again, mass pickets and all the rest of it. But, I mean, I'm not going to go into it. I can't spend time on the steel strike, but it was a total washout, frankly, because at the end of the day, TUC did broker the deal. They came in again, of course. But, as far as I can tell from that strike, little or nothing was achieved by that. And most of the closures carried on from that day on. Other people might know more about it. But anyway, I would say that was a win for the government in my mind, as I recall. So despite the mass activity in certain areas, it was a win for the government there. And that was a lead up to what they were hoping to do. By the way, I suppose there was a lot of discussion later on when, of course, miners were out picketing steel plants that the steelworkers didn't get the support they'd hoped for from the miners. Did get some support from the miners, by the way, but not as much as some of them had hoped for. That had an effect later on as well, I think. By the way, in between all this, I mean, another thing, I mean, you can argue about this, I don't know whether it's true or not, but given all of what I've said about the strikes before in the mines, you know, which involved like mass picketing on nearly every occasion of the big strikes, you know, confrontation on a big scale with the police, confrontation with scabs, all sorts of other stuff going on that was you know, a pretty big scale even before the 84-85 strike. I mean, and the plan not being quite ready with the Tories. They were obviously reaching a point where they were going to test the water on a bigger scale. But one of the things that happened in 81 was the Brixton riots. Don't you remember Brixton riots and all that? Now, I don't know whether that was an issue or not, but it has been suggested that one thing they didn't, you know, there was some worry about this. There was a worry about, you know, rebellion on the streets and all the rest of it. And it's like that kind of delayed some of the Tories' plans. Quite ready there with all that sort of legislation and everything else. I don't know if that's true, but that's one suggestion. So, well, the Brixton riots and the riots that followed were something the government shook the government up a bit. Basically, what they didn't want was that kind of thing going on at the same time as they were launching into the lines, basically. I don't know if that's true, but it's a suggestion that's been made. But anyway, I mean, the point about that was that the attacks were delayed in a sense, and so it was, you know, it was coming on to sort of January '83 really before more waves of closures started to be announced. The first ones were mainly in Scotland and South Wales, which was interesting again because, again, miners didn't wait around, didn't hang around for a ballot or anything, they were out. So the big wildcat strikes in Scotland in particular and in South Wales. And they sent pickets. Well, where did they send the pickets? Well, sent them to Yorkshire, didn't they? Well, it's not something that Yorkshire and NUM actually wanted. They definitely were not keen on this idea of coming out of this stage. I mean, some people argued that this was a sensible tactic, it was too early, you know, they weren't ready and all that kind of stuff. But either way, it was not something that they were very keen on. But certainly in Selby, at least, miners were picketed out. So the big Selby coal mine came out during that period. And then almost immediately, that's when Scarborough made his big announcement about how he'd come across this secret plan for this huge cut, but cut back in the mines. You remember that? It was a secret plan. For years it was supposed to be secret. Of course it was true actually. It wasn't secret, I'm sure the other thing was it really secret? I don't think so. I think it was a deliberate leak, because this was gearing up for the big fight. And that it was supposedly 70 pit closures, 70,000 job losses. This was big stuff, Unofficial strikes carried on in Scotland at that point. There was an NUM conference to ban overtime. This was the thing about, let's get the stocks down. Which is kind of sensible in a way, but because the stock's actually been built out really big, the plan was starting to work. The government preparation was going on. So it was an overtime ban, and in principle it was going to be followed by a strike. And, there was all sorts of other provocation going on. If you worked in any places with this kind of quite well-planned build-up to a strike that the employers wanted, you'll see this sort of thing. And that is all sorts of irritating things go on. Like there's every industry has a disciplinary code. Coal mines have a disciplinary code. But coal mines were a pretty stroppy lot. If you work underground with 8 or 10 of your mates, and there's a bond there underground work. It's dangerous. It's dangerous stuff. You form a real bond. And there was an element over a period of time in the mines of you could call it kind of job control. There was a kind of a balance, between what the managers could tell you to do and what you were prepared to do. And there were certain things you organised yourself, especially when you're underground, and which were accepted and were tradition, and you were allowed to do that. Suddenly, managers started getting hefty about this. They started trying to impose things that they had never tried to impose before. They started to impose discipline. If you were like 5 minutes late for your shift, you'd be sent home. Things like this. Suddenly, you'd arrive for your shift one day, and they say, "Oh no, we've had to suspend all work today for health and safety work." Nobody knew about why. And so all manner of things, basically, to sort of rile people, because they knew, it would be unofficial. People would start going out and moving, And basically, that's what happened. So we already had some unofficial strikes, and then you had all these kind of niggling things with smaller strikes, smaller disputes, and smaller problems going on throughout. And that's where it all started, really. So the NCB then, that wasn't enough to get everybody out. So then they think, oh, bugger it, we'll just go for the big one. So the NCB then announces they're going to shut Cornwall Wood in South Yorkshire. So very, very militant area, big pit. And not only that, this was March 84, right? They said we're going to close Cornwall Wood. When was it going to close? In April. They announced it in March, and it's going to close at the beginning of April. So this was just red rag to a bull, if you like. And they knew, and there was just like people just walked out. Everybody just walked out. There were no meeting. Nothing. People just got up and walked out. Literally, that's what happened. And then they added another 20 pits. Oh well, there's another 20 pits as well. And that is just sort of kept sort of ratcheting the whole thing up. So then what you got in effect was a series of strikes, initially unofficial and then made official. And the whole thing was just rolling out. So you'd already got this action that had been building up in Scotland. So after a short while, basically most of the Yorkshire and the Scottish pits were out, and then South Wales, the North East, and it just rolled out after that. Some places like Lancashire, where myself and my colleagues were quite active in Lancashire, not one of the quote more militant areas and all the rest of it. Can't remember his name now. Sid somebody, wasn't it? He was the horrible guy that ran, sort of was in charge of the NUM in Lancashire anyway. They were going to have ballots, so they were going to have a ballot. Right, but bearing in mind that half the culprits are all out on strike, and the determination of the gold rule. So at this point, they're going to hold a ballot, but at this point, the pickets are already out. So Lancashire was already starting to have pickets from the North East Sunderland, from Yorkshire, And I think even by Kent, because Kent were out those times as well, so people, this activity was going on a big scale. Now, where were the sticky areas? Well, Lancashire was always split. I mean, some pits were quite militant, had more of a history of wildcat action, and the rest of it, some didn't. The usual sort of mix in Lancashire. But bearing in mind all the stuff about productivity deals and all that stuff that we said before that had gone on, you had a situation, obviously, where in Nottinghamshire in particular, and parts of the Midlands, there was suggestions there would be a ballot for a strike, but certainly there wasn't strong support for it at that stage. Pickets were starting to move out in those areas, and at that point, this is when the police action started. The plan that was put in place, it was there, it was ready to go, and almost immediately something, I don't know how reliable these figures are, they're sort of rough and ready, but roughly 2,000 police were billeted in army barracks in Nottinghamshire, ready to deal with this. That's a hell of a lot of police to move. You've never seen anything that size, really. You've seen it on a smaller scale in Scotland and various other places. But this was really big stuff, and that was just the beginning of that process. The other thing that started happening was all sorts of things went on, actually. But other things we know about now, which was phone tapping. The other thing, we all know about it now. Basically, phone taps all over the place. All the NUM offices and a lot of private places after a while were phone tapped to try and get information on where pickets were going and why they were going. I mean, that got round by miners after a period of time, but it was quite a long time actually before it became apparent. I mean, when it did become apparent, eventually, when it was picked up, people used to give, they used to tell us this, we are going to picket, whatever, Ollerton or something, and they'd turn up somewhere else, So I mean, people were imaginative, did find a way around this, but it took quite a while for that to happen. So there were a lot of problems around that. There was also, I don't remember this, but a guy called David Jones was killed by a scab. I think it was during the mass picketing of Ollerton, if that mentioned Ollerton. Again, this was not something entirely. It's weird. I mean, you've got a situation with the NUM, where it was controlled by the left, basically. It was a left-dominated NUM, a militant union. The union as a whole was under threat. Not just the mines, but the union, the whole structure of the union was under threat. So they were fighting for their life in the same way that the miners were fighting for their life. So from time to time, they would call for a mass picket. But on the other hand, if it got out of hand, then they'd be rolled in to say, well, hang on a minute, lads, we want a mass picket, but basically we want it peaceful. A bit of shoving, a bit of backwards and forwards, But we don't actually want you to kind of riot or attack the police or attack this guy. It's like, it's a funny thing. It's not that there wasn't militant action, but if it went too far, if it got out of hand from the union's point of view, then the officials would be wheeled in, including Scarborough. Scarborough was particularly wheeled in on this particular occasion to stop the pickets getting out of hand, if you like. As in revenge, basically. There were battles between the police and the pickets, but it was like, as soon as this guy was killed, it was like they were out for revenge, but he did his job, so it's funny, it's a militant guy, left-wing guy, you see, but he's there at the right time when required to sort of calm things down. Bold Pit in Lancashire just came out in the end. It was just like they weren't waiting, they came out on strike. I'm taking too long, aren't I? I'm going to try and speed
it
up.
It was a long strike.
Sorry?
It was a long strike.
It was a long strike, and I've been trying, The second bits are very short, you'll be glad to hear. So, there was a whole load of things that happened over the whole period of strike, some of which you'll be familiar with. I'm not going to repeat every episode because, there's lots of examples you can give, but a lot of the things just took place everywhere, all over the place. The whole nation, if you like, or all the mining areas were sort of drawn into it, but also large parts of the rest of the working class were drawn into it in various ways. The hit squads, right? What was the point at all? There was picketing, and there was small-scale picketing and mass picketing. What were the hit squads? Well, the hit squads were really, essentially unofficial. When I say unofficial, it doesn't mean that no NUM officials weren't involved. Some more militant NUM officials weren't involved. David Douglas will doubtless tell you, in his book. But they were essentially unofficial, small groups of workers organised clandestinely to go out and hit weak points. Now the weak points there might be actual scabs, there might be coal delivery lorries on the motorway, and there were some famous incidents there of coal delivery lorries being broken by people shoving things off the motorway bridges, or minicabs in one case, with scabs, driving scabs in. There was a lot of physical stuff like that. There were attacks on NCV offices, physical attacks. Attempts to smash them up, burn them down. NCV buses that were used for strikers and non-NCV buses that were used for strikers were attacked in their depots. Some were just, dozens were burnt out in various places. A whole range of things over a period of time as the strike wore on, including, I suppose you call them riots, really, and not just miners. It might be just, bearing in mind you had pit villages, which were pit families. So everybody there, whether it was young, whether it was the youth, if you like, non-working school kids, or the miners' wives, or other relatives, or other friends that, everybody was involved in one way or another. The police were going in, so some of these villages were almost under military occupation. Really, really a military occupation. People, the fights between the police and miners, there's some films, isn't it? You see it and treated in a very sort of nostalgic way in, Billy Elliot and things like that, But that was going on, but it was going on all over the place. So, it's just a weird situation in many ways. Attacks on shops, by the way, there were actually attacks on shops. Any shop that didn't offer credit was often, in a lot of places, a few that did offer credit probably in the process. But there was a kind of decision there. It was like, if you weren't offering credit to miners and you were rating it, basically, then you get your window pushed in or stuff taken out and redistributed, stuff like that. Obviously, the miners' wives were getting very organised. Still very much on the sexual division of labour for the most part, but that did start to change during the course of the strike. So, originally miners' wives were organising food collections, money collections, creches for the kids, all these sorts of things. A traditional role, but nonetheless, not one that had been collectively organised in previous times. It was a big collective effort. So quite important in keeping the strike going. And over a period of time, then a lot of miners' wives started to challenge that. They want to be out on the picket line. They want to be doing their fair bit of attacking or sorting scabs out, or sometimes, I remember there was I don't know whether it ever happened, there was an attempt by wives of striking miners to explain somewhat wives of scab miners to sort of go out and strike themselves, in the sense of kind of housewife strike, like don't cook the bastard a meal. Tell them things like that. I don't know if it was very successful, but it certainly was an idea that was floated at the time. And obviously the pickets were everywhere now. So you're talking steel plants, power plants, docks for the imports. They're spreading out all over the place, and on a really big scale. The school kids' strikes, actually, that was the other thing that happened. That was very many times, but in several places, especially in Yorkshire, there were quite a few school kids' strikes. In most places, was there one where you worked?
There was one.
There was one where you worked.
There was one where I worked.
Shortly
after some miners had
Guy was one of the rare teachers who wasn't acting in the usual teacher disciplinary role and trying to gather all the striking school kids back into school. The policeman's role was quite heavily there, but there were a few cases where it didn't work. So there were quite, there was an air of rebellion around generally. And then, of course, you had the famous thing where the Augury coking plant was picketed. Again, mass pickets, battles with the police. And again, it was, in a way, this was Gargill attempting to repeat what I mentioned about the Saltley event, And there were calls, official calls, for unions to support it. But it wasn't like groups of workers going to other groups. It was very much a kind of top level, official level, you should support this and all the rest of it. Anyway, there were big pickets, mostly miners. Some other workers joined in. Now, I don't know if this is true. Can this really be true? But maybe it is if you see some of the films of what happened at the time. I was told there were up to 6,000 police involved in this operation in the end. Conceivably so. It was certainly a big operation on their part to try and keep this place open. But what it descended into something what you might call a kind of medieval battle, really. And it was a heavy battle at times. I remember there were incidents of miners using all kinds of weapons against the police, the ball bearings, the oil and all that against the police forces. Telegraph poles were ripped up and used to sort of try and deal with the police lines and all the rest of it. And I suppose you could say the pickets gave the police a run for their money, but a lot of them were badly injured as well. In fact, a lot of those that were badly injured and took to local hospitals, some of them that took to the hospitals were subsequently arrested by the police, of course, and others that were then, that went round, and unfortunately a lot of injured miners weren't taken to local hospitals and actually carted away elsewhere because they realised as soon as they turned up at the hospital they were going to get arrested. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on, really. I mean, what you can say about it is that it did describe the militancy of the miners, it did describe how they were prepared to take on the police and the other forces of the state. But in many ways, it was a huge kind of diversion. There was a story went round that police elsewhere, that were involved in pigs and things elsewhere, were actually encouraging miners to go there. The big battle's down there. That's where you want to be. Type of thing. We're waiting for you. Why don't you go there? I don't know whether that was made up or not. But you can kind of see the point here. It was a set-piece battle, and you can say, well, it had some effects. I think some of the coal deliveries were temporarily suspended, but basically it didn't, it wasn't going to shut this place on a sort of permanent, a long-term basis, if you see what I mean. And it basically diverted attention from all the other places where pickets were being active. The other thing that was going on, I don't know if everybody remembers, but there was harassment all over, apart from the pit villages. There were a lot of places where just people going around collecting money in buckets were stopped by the police. Any excuse, you're not allowed to collect here. You haven't got a permit. All this kind of stuff went on endlessly all over the place. Right, so I'm not going to repeat all these other things, but one thing that is, I suppose, worth mentioning, there was some blacking of coal deliveries by the railway man. But it was sporadic. It wasn't there was some official support for it. Basically, it was, the official union would say, if you blacked coal, they would kind of support you. But it wasn't exactly kind of official action. It was like unofficial action with backing if you were subject to discipline. That kind of thing went on. There was a dispute later on, I'm going to speed this up, so there was a dispute later on where I think it was a one-day strike later on, where because there'd been, again, police harassment of coal, of drivers that were blacking coal. There was harassment of that, and then that led to a strike. But basically, workers were walking off, the railway were walking off, and the National Union called a one-day strike. So it was a one-day protest strike, and everybody went back to work. There was still some blacking of coal, but again, it was on a sporadic basis. The big thing that would have made a difference would have been, of course, a dock strike, and there were attempts, obviously, to picket dockers. I'm going to combine this because there were two national dock strikes in different situations. One was set off by when non-registered dockers, can't go into that, but dock registration is the whole thing in itself, interesting area. But non-registered dockers were used to unload, did unload iron ore for Scunthorpe at Immingham docks. And that led to a strike for a period of time. It certainly spread throughout the registered docks and possibly some others. And I know that, some of the ferry ports out like Dover. Problems again, lorry drivers, especially owner-driver lorry drivers, big kind of, what would you call it? Exactly a battle, but a big protest from the lorry drivers against the strike. And a lot of hassle over that, and it weakened the strike, certainly in that area. And the strike eventually, in fact, did crumble without much benefit, as far as I can see. There was another big dock strike subsequently, again starting out in a similar way in a way, which was at Hunterston in Scotland. where there was a refusal in that case, a bit more positive in the sense, there was a refusal to unload Polish coal. Another whole story about that, the Scargill and Poland and Polish coal, I won't go into that one. And that was for the steelworks. That, again, that spread partly unofficial, it was an unofficial strike, if you like, in the sense of it not being formally organised initially by the National Union. This is not to say that it was outside the union framework, but nonetheless it did spread to quite a few. Well, it spread to Hull, London and Liverpool at least, and I think possibly further than that. On this occasion, again, TUC stepped in and got a deal. As far as I can tell, that deal didn't do anything really. The other thing is that the only way it got any kind of official backing was where it involved unregistered dockers. I mean, that was the sort of National Union thing was, well, we would do something if it was unregistered dockers. But in terms of like direct solidarity with Black and Coal, it was all very iffy as far as the official union was concerned. I mean, they had many disputes of their own, if you see what I mean, apart from that, which could have been an issue and could have provided the basis for sort of joint action on common, for their own purposes at the same time, but that wasn't pursued. The other big event, I suppose, was in October '84, was of course, which would have made a big difference, because I know we often say, well, I remember, I think Wildcat, I was in at the time, actually said in one of its articles, I think rather falsely in my opinion, that said, this strike could never win as a result of trade unionism, commitment to trade unions and trade unionism. Actually, I think it was an overstatement, because it was kind of true in a theoretical way. But one of the things that would have made a really big difference was, remember October '84, remember how long this strike had been going on? Now it's true, a lot of NACOS people weren't going into work. There was a lack of safety cover in some places. A lot of NACOS people, the foremen if you like, were not happy about this. There was a lot of harassment. They were under a lot of pressure from the coal board and even the police and everything else, to go into work. And pretty pissed off. And they were going to suffer from, obviously as well, from cutbacks in the mines. So they did have an interest actually in joining this strike. Limited pressure from the NUM, it has to be said, I think, in an official capacity to try and get them out. But anyway, that's aside. At this point, there was a ballot to strike, and 85% of the NACOS people voted to go on strike. And they were on the verge of going out, so I mean literally on the verge of going on strike. And suddenly, the union leadership in NACOS, or part of the union leadership, suddenly came up with a deal and called it off at the last minute. And there wasn't much, there was no real history of sort of wildcat action like there was with the rest of the miners. There wasn't really no history. A pretty disciplined force. So as soon as it was called off, they would just say, oh, well, we'll go on strike then. We'll just carry on as we were before. But it was because the government had actually stepped in. The one thing the government didn't want at this point was the possibility of actually all the pits closing down. And, so they had stepped in and they'd worked with the government to offer what was a really crappy deal, that there was a kind of slightly revised conciliation procedure over disputes that were arising in NACOS. And an amended closure review procedure, not this closure review procedure, it was useless actually. And it was, it was something and nothing in the way of an offer, but it seemed enough to get them not to go on strike. That was a pretty critical thing really, because that would have made a difference, even within the framework of trade unionism. If that, that level, they had come out as well, that would have made quite a big difference. There's all sorts of other odd things went on. The state was involved in many different ways. Do you all remember Roger Windsor? Scargill's right-hand man, really, wasn't he, in many ways? The money man. All the rest of it. Well, it turned out he was employed by, was it MI6 or MI5? He was a direct plant. He was working for the state all the way along. And it was him, wasn't it? It was, the photograph was taken of him shaking hands with Mr. Gaddafi, taking up, it was a brown bag or something of money. It never appeared anywhere. It obviously just disappeared into the mist, that money and all the support and all that. But it did, certainly in terms of public relations, as it were, it didn't go down too well in this country. But look, some people said, ooh, that was bad timing. It was around about the time of the NACOS thing as well. And it was like, ooh, didn't exactly do any good. Well, who was running that? Well, the state was running that, as much as anybody else. The other thing that happened then was, having got ACODs out of the way, they then offered, remember October, November this was, right? So then the NCB offered another deal, it offered some more money. Yeah. There was a lot of money on offer, by the way, even then, it was pretty big. By today's terms, big money was being offered to people to take redundancy. You know, it's almost unbelievable. But on top of that, they said, right, if anybody goes back before Christmas, £600 cash bonus. A £600 cash bonus in them days, you know, to somebody that had been out on strike for 9 months or whatever it was. Fucking hell, that was really tempting.
For Christmas.
I mean, the surprising thing is, miners did. There was the beginnings of a drift back to work in some areas, and some miners did take it. The surprising thing is how many miners didn't take it, you know, even after 9 months. So that was incredible. I mean, after 9 months, there was still in all the coal fields that were going to suffer as a result of the closures. In all those fields, you'd say the vast majority of miners were still out after 9 months. So that was pretty incredible. And it was for all the reasons that we've seen. And I'm nearly done that now.
You'll be able to skip through.
Yeah, we'll have to skip through. Having carefully labelled all these, I think I've lost one somewhere, but anyway.
You got some on the floor.
Oh, that might explain it. Shouldn't have told them that, should we? Right, that one goes on one side. Right, yeah, that's right. I mean, the only thing, it's difficult to get all this across, isn't it? But a lot of miners said they had the best, it sounds stupid, doesn't it? But, Christmas, you think, fucking hell, Christmas, you know. Oh, by the way, Bob Geldof was around at this time doing his thing, you know, at the same time. That's a bit of a sideshow. It was a sideshow in some way, but anyway, and you think, well, bloody hell, what a Christmas, going to be a really rotten Christmas, this, isn't it? But a lot of miners did say it was one of the best Christmases they had. Now, can you believe that? The only reason you can believe that is because the one thing that did come out of all of this process, not for everybody, not for all the miners necessarily, obviously not for the working miners and the scouts, and not necessarily for a lot of miners that just stayed at home and stayed out a little, but for all the miners, and large numbers of them, remember, that were involved in activity of some sort or other during the strike, whatever it was, whether it was travelling abroad, because there was travelling abroad to get resource and to try and get action, especially in the docks and so on, going to meetings, going to support groups, involved in the hit squads, involved in organising in the pit villages, involved in the kitchens, that whole thing, a huge collective effort. And it was a big collective shindig, basically. Basically, people had a huge collective shindig over Christmas, and a lot of managers literally said that was the best Christmas they ever had. And that, I think, just says something about the level of community, if you like, that was involved in that whole process, and that, you know, would carry in people's minds for a very long time. There's just one little story I've just really got to tell you because I was really funny about one of these things. Was I call it the Kiveton Park Snowman story, and I picked it up from someone else, but I just thought it was really funny because, you can imagine, like, the pits were shut, they were shut over Christmas, most of them. There was it was snow, there was snow everywhere in a lot of places. There were braziers, I always get it wrong. That's a brazier, isn't it?
Braziers.
A brazier, that's it. You know, people trying to keep warm and all that stuff. Anyway, there's some small picket out at Kiveton. Anyway, and the police were out. They thought, we'll just make it as miserable as possible for these poor pickets. And the pickets have built this really nice snowman. And they put an old policeman's helmet on the top, which really riled the police. And apparently the local inspector tried to gear his men up to attack the snowman, and they refused, actually. So the silly sod, what did he do? He was so fucking annoyed. He got in his car and he drove at speed at the snowman. Unfortunately, the snowman was built around an old iron post. So he just went straight into it and smashed up his car. You know, it was just a lovely story, wasn't it? Not only did they have a good, even the pickets had a good Christmas, because that was really nice. But those sort of things that went on. There were lots of little things like that went on. You know, you only hear about some of them, but it was worthwhile. The other thing, by the way, just to say that during this whole period there were power cuts, but nothing like in the previous strikes. That's the comparison, isn't it? If you go back to 70, 72, did I say? 76. You know, there were some big power cuts during those periods. Even with all this action, they didn't manage to shut industry down as such. There were power cuts, but they were sporadic, they were limited, and they managed to survive. There was a lot of stuff saying, I mean, all papers saying no power cuts anyway. That's a lie, there were power cuts, but anyway. But compared with previous disputes, despite its length, it didn't achieve as much in many cases. Right. It did on the edge, I would say though. You come like January, I mean, there was worries that if it carried on much longer, then there would be serious power cuts and we would be back to the situation we were at previously. So it was a worry actually expressed and recorded subsequently. Right, anyway. The sorry end came basically in the absence of major solidarity strikes on the docks, or on the railways, or in the steel, or in other major sectors that were linked in various different ways to the coal dispute. It was eventually decided, I suppose. When you say decided, it wasn't that straightforward. At the end of March '85, there was a NUM delegate meeting at TUC HQ. TUC was kind of trying to broker things by this time. And there was a vote to end the strike. And what was really interesting was a union vote, union delegates, right? The vote to end it was 98 to 91. I mean, even at this stage, 91 official union delegates voted not to end the strike. You can see where it was coming, of course, the balance. The balance had already... There were 98 votes to end the strike.
Yeah.
There were 91 against. And this is the decision that officially ended the strike. I think this was the only time, actually, Scargill came out and actually announced this. And there was uproar, because you can imagine. I mean, there was almost a mass picket outside the TUC. And there was shouts, you know, I mean, Scargill was heckled and booed and Christ knows what else. And bearing in mind, this was the man who had managed, one way or another, to have a lot of young miners and a lot of young miner pickets going around and shouting things like Scargill, Scargill forever and things like this, you know. But by this time, anyway, they certainly weren't saying that. So there's still a lot of opposition to going back, but that was the official decision, and the discipline of the union and the extent to which it was able still to control it meant that despite that opposition, it was largely enforced. I say largely enforced because certainly all the pits didn't go back straight away. I think Kent stayed out quite a lot longer. Kent were very keen. I mean, some people suggested, well, actually, we were better off. They were next to London and they were getting huge amounts of support from wealthy Londoners. You know, wealthy Londoners? The proletariat of London, or whatever, anyway. But anyway, there was all sorts of odd ideas of why they were more militant than everybody else. But they did stay out longer, that's true. And also, there were lots of sporadic small-scale strikes even after that, because there was no deal. I mean, this was going back without a deal. Miss Scargill came out and said, oh, the miners haven't been defeated. We showed them, we gave them a run for their money. Everybody else was fucking pissed off. It was obviously a fucking defeat, you know. And no deal. So no deal meant that, remember, by this time, there were loads of miners had been sacked. You know, people that were, almost anybody that was taken to the courts, you know, was sacked by the coal board, basically. Anybody involved in any kind of violence, anything, sacked by the coal board. Loads of sacked miners, right? There were miners in prison by this time, you know, and there was no deal over any of this. So there were a lot of pits where, I mean, several of them came out momentarily or didn't go back straight away because they were still trying to argue that they shouldn't go back until they had at least had a deal over the sacked miners, if nothing else. But these didn't last, and one reason it didn't last was, again, the discipline of the union. And most of the union officials, wherever any of these strikes broke out, they were basically in there like a shot, getting them back into work. It's like, decision's been made now, lad. Everybody goes back, that's it. Again, lots of smaller strikes over, for the following year in particular, and longer actually, there were lots of smaller strikes. Again, over disciplines, of course, because by this time, gung-ho management. You say last time this happened after every, you know, it was, they were determined to get rid, as far as possible, of all those things I talked about, that an element of control of how the job was carried out, especially underground, how it was carried out, was to enforce discipline right down to the last man on the job, you know what I mean? And no leeway, no flexibility. So there's a lot of that going on, and loads of strikes emerged over that, but they were pit by pit or area by area. There was some picketing out on it. There were still attempts to pick it out. But again, it was all sporadic. It was this pit, this area, that area, and that, you know, there was no momentum behind that to take that any further. And of course the closures and the redundancies continued. So I mean it was a heavy defeat from that point of view. The only thing I'd say is, just whizzing past the aftermath of the strike, which I'm not going to talk about, is that it took a hell of a long time to decimate the coal industry altogether. It didn't happen like the year after, the first year, the second year, or 3 years after that major defeat. It went right through really. I mean, it involved many local disputes and many wildcat strikes for many years. And I mean, I'm just trying to think when it was really, but it was, you're talking about 92, 93 really. Because bear in mind, at the end of the day, what the few pits that were left were eventually privatised. Because one ended up as a workers' co-op, didn't it? Town Colliery, I think it was. Didn't last, but anyway. Something odd happened at Monkton Hall, or I don't know, I think that. And then there was, you know, the 2 or 3, I think, well, two main private contractors that took over. Some of them had already been opening the old open cast pits, of course. There was a lot you could say about that, because for a long time, not entirely, there were pickets sent to open cast mines, but for a long time, it was viewed as a, you know, it was, the dispute was with NCB, it was British coal, British miners, didn't involve open cast. You know, they were left to their own devices for months, actually, until anybody said, hang on a minute, how come we're not over? But they're not in our union. I think it was TG, wasn't it? Organised Open Cast Mine Areas, all that kind of thing went on. So I'm not going to say all that, but it took a hell of a long time to get from the defeat of that huge strike to actually closing the lines down and privatising them. A lot of strikes and a lot of disputes. So it wasn't, if you like, Scargill was wrong. It was a huge defeat, but it didn't kind of completely decimate the willingness of miners, for various reasons, to fight over disciplinaries, over particular disciplinaries and control on the job and various other things like that. Of course, the national NUM was more or less squeezed out. The NUM locally, however, gradually in many places sort of re-established a certain amount of control and liaison, including with the new private coal owners in some cases. So that was it. So the lessons, I'm sorry about that. I thought it was quicker than that. Just let me get the last thing there. What are the lessons? They're all bloody obvious mostly, aren't they really? I suppose for us they're all obvious, but they're obvious for everybody else, I don't know. I've lost the bloody card now. Well, I mean, the obvious thing is the role of the state. I mean, for us that may sound commonplace, but when you think about it, I mean, there aren't many occasions in our experience, certainly in my lifetime, where virtually every arm of the state has acted in a concerted and coordinated way to defeat a struggle of the working class or a section of the working class. So you're talking about the organisation, the police, well, the law first, the law obviously, lots of changes in the law to defeat them. The police on a mass scale, I mean, acting within the law and also outside of the law, of course, in many cases. The army, in some cases, was drawn in. I mean, there's a lot of stories about the army being drawn in, either being dressed up in police uniforms or whatever. Of course, all sorts of, when I say illegal, all sorts of things that we're quite familiar with now. You know, I mean, there's a big fuss, you know, about the police taking their tags off. You know, in recent years. It's been going on for years, hasn't it? Yeah. It certainly went on a huge scale during the miners' strike. I mean, nothing new there at all. So the police, the courts, the law, the police, the courts, the prisons, of course, involved in all of that. The secret services, hugely involved. Those plants, you know, in terms of planting people, agents provocateurs, right up to the height of Windsor, of course, and all that. The phone tapping, the putting out of false news stories. I mean, the whole thing, huge, you know, huge activity by all those forces that we recognise directly as the state. The political parties, well, obviously the Tories. Can't remember what the Lib Dems were up to. Well, they didn't have Lib Dems, didn't we? But whatever they were, can't remember anyway. Only Tories anyway. So, you know, that was obvious. But the Labour Party, well, as usual, I mean, the Labour Party, part of the state in that sense, you know, it's the loyal opposition at this point. Kinnock, you know, Kinnock got pelted with tomatoes at the end of the intro as well and chased around in various places. It was Willis, I think it was TUC, wasn't it? He actually got sticks and stones thrown at him, or bottles or something. I mean, these people were, you know, the personifications of the enemy within, as far as we were concerned, you know, the real enemy within. But even by that time, of course, Scarlett was less popular by that time, and then people like Mugabe, who was, you know, had a certain amount of popularity. I was told, I know it was true, but I was actually beaten up after the strike, but they certainly, he was harassed, shall we say, at the least, and may well have been beaten up at the end of the strike. But I mean, these people, you know, the political parties, so they played their role. Now, some people argue against that, and they'll say, well, you know, I mean, we do know cases, individual Labour Party members, you know, contributed to money for the miners. Some Labour Party constituencies contributed premises occasionally, things like that. Yeah, I mean, after all, they are working class people. There was sympathy, especially in the mining areas, amongst, if you like, the rank and file. But it's, you know, it was at the most minimal level, if you like, to the extent there was any support. All the official machinery, all the official party machineries were clearly not only against the strike, wanted it settled as quickly as possible, but were definitely against any extension of the strike, whether it was to other groups of workers, any kind of resistance by the miners to the violence of the state in the form of the. And remember, this was resistance. You know, it was resistance in the sense that they were under attack, they were being restrained, they were being controlled. Obviously, it became a positive violence after a while because, you know, there does come a point in a struggle where you're not just trying to defend yourself because, you know, as they say, best form of defence is attack. There comes a point where you just got to go out and attack before they get you. You know, and that's what happened in many cases in the miners' strike. What else? The media. Well, you know, I mean, we all know now, don't we, that things like Albury and all that were, you know, pictures were just sliced the other way. You know, attacks by police on miners were shown as attacks by miners on police. Yes, they were fighting with each other, but how did the thing start? The media as a whole was like against the strike throughout. I mean, there was a case. Well, I tell you what, they were very sympathetic afterwards, weren't they? After the defeat of the miners' strike, later on, when there was a big push to close even more mines, then suddenly there was a media, I don't remember it, there was a media campaign there. Even the old Tory got up and said, this is terrible, you know, the poor old miners, they've been through a terrible time. We shouldn't really be shutting down the whole of the British coal industry, you know. And then you have people like the Daily Mirror and the Guardian and a few others, you know, were running around saying, yeah, you know, the miners, we're right behind them, this shouldn't be happening, you know. This was after the defeat, you know. So certainly they didn't want them to go out on strike, even then. So, you know, the media and, I mean, it was just concerted effort. And bearing in mind, whether you theoretically talk about the media as part of the state or not, it's quite clear that the state was linked with it. At the establishment level, these people were meeting with each other all the time. You know, I mean, physically meeting with each other and organising these things and making sure that the right stories went out in the press, not the wrong stories. And that's how it works. What about the rest of the state? So we mentioned Social Security. The laws were there. There may have been some sympathetic workers, again, in Social Security. There were some sympathetic workers. But unfortunately, these places weren't confronted. Actually, did confront them later in the jobs JSA. That was another debate, but confronting people that were having their benefits cut in the JSA. Actually, there was very few, as far as I can tell, very little attempt by miners in most cases to confront the DHS over the fact that they weren't getting any money, basically. So there were problems there. The state was active there. And again, coordinated. It was all coordinated. It was all part of one quite clear coordinated plan. Call it conspiracy if you like. I don't care. You know, there are cases where these things are organised, planned and coordinated by the state to defeat a group of workers. And obviously that leaves you with the union. Well, I've said, you know, how the TUC as a, if you like. The umbrella union was operating in many different ways, and certainly operating that way. What about the union itself? Well, we've kind of given on it examples of loads of others. The way that the official union machinery, if you like, acted to limit the strike. But I suppose that the difficulty with that is that in that level of closure, that level of dismissal, that refusal of any kind of compromise, the removal of the union as, if you like, an arm of middle management even. You know, no more beer and sandwiches, no more industrial relations boards, no more, even on the local pit for a lot of the time, no more regular meetings with the local management to sort the odd problem out. When it reaches that position of no compromise, the union machinery is under threat. So basically, both are under threat, both have got a life and death struggle. It doesn't mean their interests are exactly the same, and clearly they diverged at critical points during the strike. But they also sort of diverged at a more fundamental level of, you know, which I've said in a way, it's like when it comes to the crunch, when the stakes are that high, when the state is that determined, one group of workers really can't win on their own. The problem was, as I said in the previous examples, miners had won on their own from time to time in the right circumstances. But when the stakes were higher, they clearly couldn't. But people, the union still operated on the same basis. And of course, many miners themselves still have had it in their mind that they could do it on their own. And it took a long while before miners, and too late really, before many miners began to realise that they couldn't do that. And they had to look to extend the strike, and certainly extend the picketing. I mean, even Dave Douglas, funny enough, mentions in his book that Orgreave was a complete diversion and waste of time, and that they should have been, for instance, picketing power stations and other places much earlier on, and in a much more organised way. I mean, and other groups of workers. I mean, that's interesting he says that, because he slagged us off when we were saying it in the middle of the miners' strike, but that's another matter. It was something he recognised at a later date. So, all of that is the way in which it operates. And I think, you know, my view is, as a result of all that, is that what it does show is that it's not whether the union is left or right. Even a left-wing union, even a very militant union, will still operate in the same way. I mean, all the other sides of it, which you can add to it, is kind of the whole corporatism of the thing, the whole sort of stuck with the plan for coal. The plan for coal was for running down the mines, but it was for investment, but also redundancies. The plan for coal with the Labour government. You know, this whole kind of thing about and you know, our industry and our mines, and I mean, some of it came after nationalisation, but it wasn't just about nationalisation. It was a whole kind of identification with this particular industry and protecting our industry. The whole thing about imports, you know, and oh well, the way it could survive is to stop all import. You know, not just during the strike, but just like anti-imports, you know, and all that kind of stuff that went with it, which was really strong in the NUM and in most unions. And you could go further than that, actually. You could say the whole identification with the job. Because one of the things that always struck me about, you know, I said there was the nature of the work, the danger, the underground work in particular, it bred that kind of loyalty and that kind of bond, which was very useful in many times, in terms of solidarity, in terms of fighting the boss, yeah, and all the rest of it. But it also had another side of it, and that was competition. I remember, I mean, one of my uncles was a miner, and I always remember him going on and on and on about how he and his team cut more coal than anybody else in their pit, you know, and their pit cut more coal than anyone put up their own. You know, this whole kind of, you know, I don't know, it was a weird thing. It was kind of a pride in the job. Now, you could say, well, yeah, well, that's not a bad thing, you know, in a sense. But it can be a weakness as well as a strength. It can be a weakness, you know, when your identification with the job becomes so key. And by the way, this applies to everybody, really. It applies worse if you go further up the hierarchy. So obviously the NACLOT, you see what I mean, identification with the job, even more problematical. It was undermined during the strike. The number of miners that were told, well, you've got to let safety in, you'll have to let knackers in, otherwise the pit's going to be drowned and going to be knackered. Pits were drowned and knackered, by the way, during that strike. And loads of miners turned around and said, well, fuck it, I don't want to work down the fucking mine anyway, it's the right load of crap. Just let it go. Now that was weird, but that was weird in a way, because it kind of contrasted completely with the other kind of attitude and psychology that I described. But that was the change that took place. To have a major dispute, to be able to follow it through, you've got to, if you like, break away from identification with the job and identify with the class, if you know what I mean. Class solidarity can't emerge, and can't develop, and can't work, and can't win us battles if half of our head is attached to more to the job than it is to our interests as a class. It's worse for teachers, of course. People like my job that I used to do as a housing worker, and various other, even worse, because if it's just to some extent, it's just a manual job, and you're in and out, and the more you get temporary work as well, it's like, how the fuck can you be identified with that if you're just in and out of the job all the time? Just one job's much like another, isn't it? It's interchangeable. You are, after all, an interchangeable commodity at the end of the day. So, you know, I think as to the extent that spreads, that undermines things, but it also, it has, you know what I mean? These things have strengths and weaknesses. It's quite a contradictory situation. And that's something perhaps worth exploring. Thanks, we'll finish. Sorry, I took as long as I did. Sorry.
Actually, I don't mind it actually going on and all that because it was an extremely detailed account of the build-up towards the miners' strike, and which I think was really important. And I think that Mike did a really good job at that. One of the problems, obviously, is a question of time, but I think that there wasn't enough on the strike itself and the problems of the strike itself. An awful lot which I agree with, for instance, on the question of the need of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist class, really to smash this particular sector of workers. And I think that first of all, I think we have to situate the miners' strike in Britain in the international context. I think it's really important to do this. We had the mass strike in Poland in 1980, which had suffered a major setback, not least through an alliance of Russia, Britain and the United States and the Solidarność trade union. Within a year or two, the workers were once again fighting the austerities right across internationally, and we saw a whole strike wave internationally. I think it's very important, and it's a discussion we've been having in the ICC, and that is the real significance of the defeat of the miners, because it just doesn't have I think a significance for miners, but it has a significance for the class, and Mike said this, and I agree with it, it has significance for the class as a whole, because it was looked at internationally. I mean, there were attempts to solve international solidarity as well with the miners' struggles. But the impact of the defeat of the miners, I think, really had international implications for the struggle internationally. So it's very important. Another point, and Mike touched upon this, was to emphasise that the 84 strike at the beginning saw a development of the self-organisation of the miners. In the first weeks of the strike, I think that this really took the union by surprise, and really had to run to actually catch up. And I think that is another important point. But I think the major point that I want to make is that the miners were defeated essentially because they were isolated in the industry and in the union. And it was the union that really insisted on this whole campaign that the miners can fight alone. Not only that, but with the question of the picketing of different pits, particularly of pits in Nottinghamshire, to really focus on this instead of actually focusing on attempts to actually broaden the strike, really led the miners into a real self-imposed isolation. And I think that was the major contributor to the defeat of the strike. That is to really attempt to say, this is a miners' fight, we want coal, not gold, etc., etc. And it wasn't just a miners' fight, it was a fight of the whole class, really. And I think that that's really important. And again, with this, the NUM really kept it within the framework of a defence of the British coal industry, and you can see this with the officials, and the nationalisation that goes with it. The NUM directed miners into set piece wars of attrition, which directly flowed, for instance, from its overtime ban, particularly the concentration on coal stocks and on Nottinghamshire at the expense of really widening the struggle. And again, another thing, another set-piece confrontation was the one at Oaktree, which Mike has actually mentioned. So we have this whole concentration on picketing out and violence and, you know, with the state, instead of actually widening the struggle. And I think that, well, shut up now because other people want to speak. But I think that these are the real lessons from the miners. Just lastly, this is not to really detract from an absolutely fantastic, magnificent fight that the miners actually put up. They really, I mean, they really put up a fantastic fight and at great expense. And it wasn't just at the expense of the miners, it was at the expense of the whole working class. And, you know, this defeat, I mean, this is, and I've heard it time and time again, you know, if the miners couldn't do it, etc., what chance have we got, etc. So I think, you know, these are some of the lessons which I think are important in the miners' strike.
Okay, thanks a lot. Anyone else? Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's been missed out here is sort of like, you know, the difference in the position, sort of like the general economic position between the late 1970s, you know, and or in the 70s in general and the 1980s. I mean, by the time the miners' strike come into pass, I mean, there was the fear and threat of unemployment, there was a general economic crisis and things like that. And that sort of like had a really serious impact on the confidence of the workers to sort of be able to go out and strike and, you know, damn the consequences, and, you know, even if, you know, they weren't particularly worried about unemployment and things like that in the mid-1970s. And I think it's not just about, that's what affected or had a really serious impact on the, you know, the lack of, you know, support from the section of the working class in the miners' strike in the 1980s. There was that fear was, you know, of, you know, losing your jobs, being unemployed, etc. And that sort of sobered a lot of people up, I think. Okay. You want to come back on that?
I've probably driven everybody into the ground. I really didn't realise it would take that long.
The other thing I'd like to add, I mean, for me, it really represented the sort of high point of sort of left bureaucracy within the trade union movement in this country. You know, I think when you look at Scarborough, I mean, you look at his sort of contemporary today, people like Bob Crow and Mark Savoca and Brian Kate, I mean, he really was to the left of all of those. And yet, you know, even with that perspective, you know, the miners simply couldn't win this insular, isolated sort of struggle. And, you know, history will repeat itself. You know, when the public sector strikes, will invariably come with this wave of cuts. You know, again, it'll be focused in, you know, dissipated within these individuals' unions. I think more than anything else, it's at the end of this 85 strike. Signal to the trade union bureaucracy, look, you know, you're not a caste or parasitic element within the workers' movement that can hold any kind of balance of power. Your job quite simply is to police the members, and if you don't do that, we'll actually get the real police to do it for you. And that really changed the whole sort of industrial landscape, I think. You know, when you look at the sort of the bits and pieces of the struggle that followed, sort of like, you know, the NGA in Wapping, and especially the Liverpool dockers, who had to go outside the entire union machinery and risk, you know, being expelled and thrown out of the union in order to even organise a large-scale strike. And I think what you find today is, especially in the big unions like the RMC and these other massive industrial concerns, a few that are left, is the smaller and smaller ever decreasing circles of strike. So whereas it might have been a national strike of, or signalman or something, now it's, the signalman at such and such a depot, or it's not all the London Underground drivers, it's just the ones on the Jubilee line and stuff like that. It's an ever decreasing sort of circle. I think, particularly with the miners' strike, it's exposed the fact that without a mass revolutionary organisation of working people, in a sense, that's all it's ever going to achieve. These industrial conflicts are going to look to these like bureaucrats, and would there be nothing outside of it, no input from a sort of revolutionary organisation, then that's the way the struggle's going to end up invariably. And I think, my experience, as I've said before, was within the sort of Trotskyist movement, is they were to the right of Scargill, they couldn't come up with anything, they couldn't intervene effectively in any of the minor support groups other than say, we need to collect more tins and we need to rattle more buckets. And I think it was interesting in that Wildcat, I think one of the pamphlets said, what were we to be? Or were we to be sort of water carriers, or, we to sort of bury ourselves in the operational part of these minor support groups. That, even today I still don't know what the answer to that is, other than, obviously trying to build a sort of revolutionary organisation and try and influence the rank and file, within those particular unions that have come into conflict.
Well, that Wildcat was very good. And it's seen the Communist Bulletin Group said they almost got beaten up by the miners for producing that anti-union stuff.
Sorry?
I said I thought the Communist Bulletin stuff group stuff was very good. They said they almost got beaten up.
Well, they did, yeah. Well, they obviously tackled it the wrong way because we never did. I mean, the one thing is worth saying. I mean, we were in the Wildcat group during the miners' strike, and we produced really terrible. When you look at it, I mean, how awful weren't they looking? But that's how awful it was. We used to print that in my back room. Printing press we bought because we couldn't afford any other way of doing it. But we went out regularly to the pits in Lancashire, and we went regularly to because the Bold miners that came out was the most militant pit, and the Bold Miners Welfare Institute in effect became the strike headquarters for the whole of Lancashire, and for all the visiting pickets that came from everywhere else. So there was loads of meetings there. What was really good is that those meetings were open. We went open meetings. We went to go to the meetings. We distributed our stuff. We had loads of arguments with different miners. We never ever got harassed, or we never had any problem with any miners as long as you were supporting the strike and you were active in it. And it wasn't just about money. You know what I mean? If you were on the picket lines, if you were engaged in the strike, if you went to meetings, if you invited them to meetings. I mean, I remember we did, in the latter part of the strike, not just Lancashire, because we had people went over to Fitzwilliam, and that's quite a good relationship with the Fitzwilliam miners, and we got some of them over to meetings we organised here. And other groups that we were associated with, which are all sort of long gone now, but I mean, groups like Workers' Playtime and London Workers Group, Counter Information in Scotland and elsewhere that we liaised with. As far as I'm aware, even, some were more politically critical than others, but I don't know that any of us got any harassment, and it was quite possible to argue for the strike but against the union and its mode of operation. It was quite possible if you went about it the right way, basically. That's all I'm saying. Obviously, it's difficult. If your only contact a group of miners had with you was the first time they ever saw you was, the first thing you said to them was, we're against the NUM. That's all they knew about you and all they ever seen. You didn't get a very good response. And I think part of the problem was maybe with the CBG, and the incident they referred to, I think, maybe around the miners' demo when, I don't know. But anyway, these things can happen. But so what? You sort of plug away. But I don't think we ever had any problems at all. So it's not true. And people should not be afraid to put a case. People can understand, you know, from you and your manner and the way you are with people and what you do, whether you're on their side basically, whether it's workers' solidarity or whether it's just some twit trying to sell a paper or, you know what I mean, or recruit their organisation. I can't see it's a problem. So never hold back the criticism. And bear in mind, as the strike developed, some of these issues became more easy to talk about. You know, and it was good. I mean, and you've got to get around. You've got to get involved. You know, and I mean, one of the things I suppose is, you know, it's noticeable we're all sort of males here. You know, but I mean, you know, there were some women involved with us who went along to sort of things at the Miners' Wives Organ and stuff like that, and got involved with that and got information back from that. You know, it's perfectly. I mean, the one thing, by the way, I didn't mention the passing was the GLF
I
thing.
know what you're in there, but Tom, you got a point on that.
Yeah, I mean, not quite sure about what Mike's saying, that if you went to the miners and they could always understand you were on their side and you were protecting the way the NUM was running the strike. I'm not sure that's always our experience. But, I mean, the main problem with the strike, which I don't think is really been brought out enough for me, was the NUM. Because the miners were obviously perceived the history, the struggle, the tradition and that. It's always been, the miners have been like the kind of solid fighting force of the proletariat. And as the presentation said, there was a massive strategy to isolate the miners, and although it was in the period, I mean, somebody was saying there was a period where workers didn't really want to get involved. I don't think that's particularly true. I think it was quite a militant period where workers did want to get involved, but there was a systematic strategy by the unions put in place to isolate the miners as much as possible. Now, obviously, everybody perceives it as, you know, there's all these nasty unions. And Mr. Scargill, Mr. sort of radical militant Mr. Scargill, was trying to do his best, but against the tide of all these nasty other unions. That's the way it's presented, and I'm not sure that's been challenged too much here tonight. But that isn't the way you should look at it. The real, I mean, Scargill, one point you should understand is that Scargill wasn't always at the forefront of the struggles. In '72, when Mike might have alluded to this, I'm not sure, but there was instances when Kent and South Wales and Scotland and that were coming out on strike, and Scargill was at the NUM in Yorkshire, and they weren't. He was, I don't know, I think he was probably conducting ballots then, holding them back with promising ballots and all sorts of stuff. You've got to follow Scargill's checkered career. When he came to London on one occasion, the Kent miners were wanting to string him up because he wasn't involved in bringing the miners in. Now, he actually made his reputation with all this false rhetoric, and then he became the head of the NUM, and that in itself was supposed to be well, for me, when the miners went on strike in '72 and whatever, they had this kind of ineffective kind of leadership, Joe Gormley or whatever. The miners organised themselves, pickets, there was lots of debate, they went across to the different coalfields and they brought each other out, and it was there were assemblies and discussions and all sorts. Now, when Scargill got to the fore, the thing that was the real downfall of the miners' strike was that it was run like a military operation. There was no discussions at all. The miners, I mean, it was all about, and one of the things I think is kind of where Mike falls into Dave Douglas's kind of logic, is kind of fetishising these kind of confrontations of hit squads and all that. That's indicative of the fact that the workers are on the back foot. They're not really in charge. They're not running things. If they have to fall back on hit squads trying to meet the police with force, never going to win, and it's a weakness. Compare the miners' strike with the Polish strike in 1980. They didn't have hit squads.
They had a massive assembly, massive discussions all across the country, and brought the government to its knees, obviously. The problem with the miners' strike, there was no discussion. Scargill turned it into a military operation. It was leaders and led. The miners were just like donkeys being sent out. I mean, I agree with everything he says about how brave and how militant they were and how ferocious they were in trying to win that strike. But they were on a hiding to nothing from the isolation of the strike. It didn't spread. There were attempts to link it up, but it was all, you know, all the engineering that was done with the military campaign was part and parcel of that reinforcing the isolation of the miners. Because workers aren't going to respond positively to hit squads and stuff. That was, obviously the media played that up to the nth degree. But in reality, it was the means by which the strike was isolated. And what we have to advocate for workers is to take the struggles into their own hands, have the largest assemblies, have the broadest debates in which they can not only discuss amongst themselves, but bring other workers in and create a rapport de force against the state, which is about unifying the working class, not about hit squads to go and strike at Orgreave or fight the police somewhere else. It's the working class can only unify itself by the broadest general. I mean, you talk about it needs revolutionary intervention, revolutionary policy. That doesn't come out of thin air. That comes out of the working class being able to develop its forces, develop its consciousness, understand the needs of the struggle, and ultimately confronting the unions. Because the one thing, again, contrasting the miners' strike with Poland didn't have any bloody unions, really. There were Stalinist unions, and they just fell apart when the strike went into gear. They defeated the strike in Poland with Solidarność, which was the methodology of the Western Trade Union. You know, to carve it up, democracy, all that, bureaucratic leadership, machinery. And that was the way they prepared the ground for butchering the Polish workers in 81 at the end of the strike. But that was based on discussion, debate, spreading the struggle, workers having proper control of it. The miners didn't have control, the union had the control, Scargill had the control, reduced them to a military campaign.
But surely, you have to be where the masses are, and the masses at that time, in 83, 84, 85, were in the NUM as miners, as union members, you know, campaigning for their own jobs, bit by bit. I mean, it's very, you know, surely you have to be in the struggle and accept, you know, like you said, you know, you've got to, when you support the same side of the group, but, you know, it's very hard to sort of go in and say, well, look, you know, this is where we are, and you need to come to. And that was a problem with a lot of the, you know, the Trotskyist groups would simply say, you know, you need to join the party. You know, your strike doesn't need to succeed so much as you come into our organisation, we're off to the barricades and you come with us. You know, there's that disparity of seeing the working class not so much as an object, but as an actual subject, someone, you know, that can fight for their own independence and for their own, you know, organisations, or even in some cases, like the NUM, take over their own organisations and wield them on their behalf to do what they want. And all these things like it was a pick, it's a part and parcel of that essential experience. You know, I think it's overly critical to say, well, you know, all that's wrong and what you need is this sort of...
That's it. That's wrong. I'm saying it's a form of weakness. It's not a way in which the struggle can go forward. Content it out of that.
But not necessarily wrong.
Well, obviously we support miners who try and defend themselves, and the violence that comes from a situation is usually a weakness, and they have to defend themselves. And
No, just
not
clarity,
denouncing violence per se, because
you haven't always got a choice. You haven't always got a choice. That's the point. I mean, because I don't disagree with you. I was trying to say that, I mean, there were, you know, it was the absence of the strike extending initially to the key areas, like steel and docks and so on. When those areas had disputes and issues of their own that they could take up jointly, that was a weakness. But all I'm saying is that these things are not always either or, and the way struggles develop for the people actually involved in them is not always a matter of an easy choice for them, put it that way. Is people do what they can in the circumstance. You have to bear in mind that there were lots of mass pickets sent out all over the country, and not just to other mines. Now, it is true, as many miners recognise after a while, that the fixation on winning the mines meant that, you know, mass pickets to stop one scab going into a mine somewhere in Derbyshire or even in Lancashire was bloody stupid, where if they could use the same numbers elsewhere going to other groups of workers. But all I'd say is that it isn't the case that there were no attempts during the miners' strike by miners and by some others to try and spread the dispute. There were. Now, they weren't always done very well, they weren't always brilliant. Certainly trade union and trade unionist attitudes were a barrier in that process, but people were fumbling around trying to find their way through the barriers, if you see what I mean. It's not a nice, simple situation where you can just say, well, that's what they should do. Well, yeah, but, you know, it's like we were out there saying a lot of these things to miners, and some people agreed. And we went on a number of pickets, certainly to power stations and elsewhere, and some of which were successful, some weren't.
No, we don't have much time left.
Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, I mean, you have to participate in the struggle as it actually faces you. Sure, you're going to get absolutely nowhere you come in the miner and say that immediately you have to actually leave the NGO. Nobody's saying that. There's a particular framework, the union framework, what my comrade was trying to say, is that it was perceived that in the end really that framework led to the isolation of the struggle, which essentially brought its downfall. Not to say that, for instance, one of the important tools, if you like, of the struggle was the creation in the 70s of the flying picket, which essentially was built around it. That's a really important way to actually spread the strike, to actually to extend the strike. But what we're trying to say is that union framework as well really led to the downfall. The fixation sort of remain within the coal industry, remain within the framework of nationalisation, etc., etc. Coal, not dole. This really isolated the miners' strike, and really ultimately led to its defeat. There was a massive confidence that the miners had in its union, by the way. In some ways, it was never really shaken. That's again is another problem. And it's not just a problem for the miners. It was a problem internationally because the defeat of the miners had an international repercussion on workers internationally. It did, because everybody was looking at the British miners because they were perceived as one of the most important sectors of the working class. So, to be able to draw the lessons, I think, is really important. One of them is that you can't get isolated like that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I just want to make a short point here. I do find myself agreeing with both the people over there, which is that you can't really understand what happens to the miners without looking at the union. And it does seem to me that there was a change, in a sense, between what happened in 1972, when miners were obviously a lot more successful in terms of contacting other workers. I mean, the Saltby Coke picket, I suppose, epitomised that, where you had, how many thousands was it? A massive number of people, yeah. And it seems that somehow between 1972 and 1984, a lot happened. And the main thing that happened is that the union, possibly partly because of all the changes that went on, I mean, you had an election of a Labour government in 1974, and that presumably helped.
the unions and the NUM get a better grip of the miners, you know, so that they were less able to spread strikes, spread the strike effectively. And I mean, one of the things that happened, nobody's mentioned this, but I mean, it seemed that there was actually quite a lot of striking miners, although solidly on strike, were not active in picketing. And the unions played a big part in stopping mass picketing, either by saying that they didn't have enough money for petrol, you know, despite their huge assets and everything, actually preventing, you know, picketing miners going out and trying to bring more of the inactive.
Not only didn't have enough money for whatever you said, they didn't have enough money to pay the miners any strike pay.
That's right, yeah. But I mean, they actually did as much to prevent active picketing. Totally different to 1972. Now, the only thing that I can put that down to is that the unions did, you know, the NUM did get a better grip of what was going on and, as you say, control things very much from the top. Prevented miners from directly contacting other workers face to face, and we saw incidents of that actually going on at that time, where you know, the potential for example, spreading strikes to stop coal going into steelworks were frustrated, and I suppose in a sense Aubrey epitomised that, because you know, there was all the potential there to stop coal going into steelworks, and yet it was all channeled into this one big spectacle, which of course then, you know, had a further sort of demoralising effect, and a lot of, you know, miners injured, you know, in the process.
I'm going to have to call it a day there, and I'm